Imagine a room 18 feet by 14 feet, stone walls, two small windows, a single wooden door with an iron lock. In the sweltering heat of Bengal, June 1756, this storage room beneath Fort William was designed to hold supplies, rope, grain sacks, broken furniture waiting for repair. But on one night it held something else entirely. 146 human beings were locked inside that space. British soldiers, company officials, merchants, women, children. The door closed at sunset. When it opened at dawn, only 23 were still breathing. This wasn't an execution. This wasn't a massacre. This was something far more terrifying, a perfectly designed machine that killed through mathematics. Heat plus pressure plus time equals death. Simple physics applied to human flesh with mechanical precision. Fort William cost the East India Company over £2 million to build in today's currency. It was meant to project power, to secure profit, to demonstrate British superiority. Instead, it created what would become known as the Black Hole of Calcutta, a single room that would haunt the British Empire for centuries. But here's what they don't teach in history class. The real horror wasn't the dying. It was how efficiently the system worked, how quickly civilization collapsed, how easily human beings could be reduced to heat and carbon dioxide through the simple application of architectural negligence. Today, we're going forensic. We're examining the blueprints, the climate data, the survivor testimonies. We're calculating the cubic feet of air, the rate of temperature increase, the precise mathematics of suffocation. We're uncovering how a storage room became a killing machine and why the British Empire needed this story to justify what came next. The Black Hole of Calcutta wasn't just a tragedy. It was a weapon. And understanding how it worked changes everything we think we know about empire, about power, and about what happens when human systems meet human limits in spaces too small to contain the consequences. The door is opening. The files are spread before us. And what we find inside will challenge everything you thought you knew about one of history's most infamous nights. The Hooghly River moves like black oil through the Bengal heat, carrying the weight of empire on its back. It's June, 1756. The air sits heavy as wet wool, thick enough to taste the salt and rot that rises from the mud flats at low tide. On the eastern bank, Fort William squats against the horizon like some mechanical beast, its stone walls breathing steam in the evening light. This isn't a fortress built for glory. It's a machine designed by the East India Company to process one thing: profit. Every angle calculated, every wall positioned to guard the flow of silk and spice that moves between ship and warehouse. But in this climate, in this season, stone becomes an oven. Timber swells and warps. Iron rusts before the morning dew can dry. And the air itself becomes a weapon that no architect ever planned for. The fort's blueprint tells a simple story. Rectangular walls, 4 bastions, a main gate facing the river. Inside, barracks, officers' quarters, a treasury, storerooms, and scattered throughout the complex small utility spaces that serve whatever purpose the moment demands. Closets become armories, pantries become meeting rooms. And sometimes, when crisis strikes, storage rooms become prisons. There's one such room that deserves our attention. 18 feet by 14 feet, tucked beneath a guardhouse on the fort's eastern wall. 2 windows, each barely large enough for a man's shoulders. A single door of teak wood, fitted with a lock that clicks shut with the finality of a coffin lid. On most days, it holds supplies: rope, sacks of grain, broken furniture waiting for repair. On most days, it's empty of everything that matters. But tonight is not most days. The siege began 3 days ago with the sound of drums echoing across the Maidan. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the young Nawab of Bengal, had finally decided that the British had grown too bold, too profitable, too permanent on his soil. His army moved like a tide across the countryside, swallowing villages and trading posts until only Fort William remained, a stone island in a sea of hostility. Inside the fort, panic disguised itself as preparation. Officers shouted orders that contradicted the orders given an hour before. Soldiers counted ammunition that wouldn't last a day. Civilians huddled in corners, clutching children and jewelry with equal desperation. And somewhere in the chaos, someone made the decision that would echo through centuries. They would fight. It was a decision born of pride rather than sense. The fort's garrison numbered barely 200 British soldiers, with perhaps twice that many Indian sepoys of questionable loyalty. Against them, the Nawab commanded 70,000 men and artillery that could reduce walls to rubble in an afternoon. The mathematics were clear. The outcome was certain. But mathematics rarely survive contact with honor, and honor rarely survives contact with heat. The first cannonball struck the western wall at dawn on June 20th, sending a shower of stone fragments across the courtyard like deadly snow. By noon, the outer defenses had cracked. By evening, the main gate hung open like a broken jaw. And by midnight, the fort belonged to Siraj-ud-Dawla. What followed was not a massacre, but something worse: organization. The Nawab's forces moved through the compound with methodical precision, cataloging prisoners, securing weapons, establishing control. They had won, but winning brought its own problems. What do you do with a fortress full of defeated enemies when you lack the infrastructure to hold them properly? The answer came from a junior officer whose name history would forget, but whose decision it would remember forever. The captives would be secured in the most convenient space available, the small guard room beneath the eastern wall. It was a temporary solution, he explained, a matter of hours. Come morning, proper arrangements could be made. 146 souls found themselves herded toward that door. British soldiers still bleeding from the fight. Company officials clutching ledgers and keys. Merchants who had bet their fortunes on the permanence of British power. A few women, wives of officers who had refused evacuation. Children whose only crime was being born to the wrong parents in the wrong place at the wrong time. The door opened onto darkness. The room measured roughly 250 square feet. Simple arithmetic suggested that each person would have less space than a grave. But arithmetic assumes order, and order was already breaking down. The first bodies pressed inside felt the walls with their hands, mapping the dimensions of their new world. Stone on 3 sides, rough timber planking on the 4th. The floor, packed earth mixed with lime, already damp with condensation. 2 windows on the western wall, each opening onto the fort's interior courtyard, where guards now walked with torches, casting dancing shadows through the iron bars. As more prisoners pushed through the doorway, the space contracted like a living thing. Bodies pressed against bodies. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Someone called for order. Someone else called for silence, but the crowd had its own momentum now, flowing inward like water seeking its level. And then the door closed. The sound echoed with mechanical finality. Metal against wood. Lock turning. Key withdrawing. Outside, footsteps moved away across the courtyard stones, leaving behind only the whisper of night wind and the distant murmur of celebration from the Nawab's camp. Inside, the real siege began. The first few minutes passed in negotiation. Voices called through the door, offering bribes that would have bought small kingdoms, gold hidden in Calcutta safe houses, trading privileges worth fortunes, personal loyalty that could be transferred like a promissory note. The guards outside listened, perhaps tempted, certainly troubled. But orders were orders, and the night was young. The windows became currency. Position near them meant access to fresh air, to sight lines, to hope. Men pressed against the iron bars like worshippers at an altar, breathing deeply of the marginally cooler air that drifted in from the courtyard. Behind them, others waited their turn, or pushed forward, seeking their share of oxygen. The arithmetic of survival revealed itself quickly. 146 people, breathing in a space designed for storage, each exhale adding carbon dioxide to air already thick with humidity, each heartbeat pumping blood through vessels that radiated heat like tiny furnaces. The temperature climbed degree by degree, turning the room into a human oven. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The voices calling through the door grew hoarse, then desperate, then angry. Someone began counting heads, trying to establish how many people actually occupied the space. The numbers varied with each count. Panic made mathematics unreliable. By the first hour, sweat had soaked through every piece of clothing. The air tasted of salt and copper and something else, something that suggested the boundaries between bodies were beginning to dissolve. Men who had spent their lives maintaining the rigid hierarchies of colonial society found themselves pressed skin to skin with clerks and soldiers and servants, rank meaningless in the democracy of suffocation. The windows drew the crowd like magnets. What had begun as orderly queuing devolved into desperate competition. Stronger men pushed weaker ones aside. Officers pulled rank that no longer existed. The elderly and the children, already struggling with the heat, found themselves pushed toward the center of the room, where the air hung motionless and thick. Water became the subject of urgent negotiation. A clay pitcher had been left in one corner, perhaps forgotten by the room's previous occupants. Its contents disappeared within minutes. Each drop fought over like liquid gold. Men who had commanded trading fleets begged for a sip like children. Others hoarded what they could in their mouths, afraid to swallow, afraid to share. The door became a focal point of hope and rage. Fists pounded against the teak planks until knuckles split and bled. Voices called out offers, threats, prayers in a dozen languages. From outside came the sound of guards talking, their words muffled, but their tone casual, untroubled. They had no way of knowing that inside, the air itself was becoming poison. As the second hour approached, the character of the crisis began to change. The initial panic gave way to something more systematic, more terrifying. The crowd began to organize itself according to the brutal logic of survival. The strongest claimed territory near the windows. The weakest were pushed into the center where standing became a struggle and breathing became a luxury. Children cried until exhaustion silenced them. Women pressed against the walls, trying to create small pockets of space around their families. Men who had built fortunes on careful calculation found themselves reduced to animal desperation, clawing for inches of air. The floor became treacherous. Sweat made the packed earth slippery. Bodies weakened by heat and terror began to stumble. And once someone fell in that crowded space, standing again became nearly impossible. The press of bodies above created a weight that crushed down like the lid of a tomb. Someone near the windows reported that the guards outside were changing shifts. Fresh torches appeared in the courtyard, casting new shadows through the iron bars. For a moment, hope flickered. Perhaps the new guards would show mercy. Perhaps they carried different orders. Perhaps they would recognize the sounds of dying that had begun to echo from within. But the footsteps passed without stopping. The door remained closed, and inside, the temperature continued to climb while the oxygen continued to thin, turning the room into a machine designed for only one purpose: the methodical conversion of human life into heat and silence. The third hour brought delirium to some and terrible clarity to others. Those pressed against the windows could see stars appearing in the strip of sky visible above the courtyard wall. The night was beautiful outside, cool and infinite. Inside, the universe had contracted to the space between one breath and the next, between the rise and fall of chests that struggled to pull life from air that offered less life with each passing minute. And still, the door remained closed, and still the machine continued its work. By the fourth hour, the room had developed its own terrible geography. Near the windows, men fought for position with the systematic desperation of drowning sailors clinging to driftwood. The iron bars became anchors in a sea of flesh, something solid to grip while the crowd surged and pressed from behind. Every breath drawn near those openings was paid for with blood from split lips and torn fingernails. The center of the room had become something else entirely. Bodies no longer stood so much as they were held upright by the pressure of other bodies. The weak had fallen first, the elderly, the wounded, the children whose small lungs couldn't compete for the diminishing oxygen. They formed a foundation of human suffering upon which the living stood, walked, and died. A merchant named Pirks, who had survived the initial fighting only to find himself trapped with his ledgers still clutched against his chest, later described the sound. Not screaming, he said, but something worse. A continuous low moan, like wind through a broken building, punctuated by the wet slap of bodies colliding and the scrape of fingernails against stone. The heat had become a living thing. It rose from the mass of humanity like steam from a forge, creating currents of superheated air that moved through the room in slow, deadly eddies. Men stripped off coats and shirts, then found that naked skin offered no relief when the air itself burned. Sweat had long since stopped evaporating. It pooled on the floor, making every step treacherous, every fall potentially fatal. Water had become memory. The clay pitcher lay shattered in the corner, trampled under feet that no longer lifted properly from the slippery ground. Men licked condensation from the stone walls, tasting lime and their own desperation. Others pressed their mouths to cracks between stones, hoping for some whisper of cooler air from outside. The door had become an altar of futile prayer. Bodies pressed against it in layers, the living and the unconscious and the dead creating a barrier of flesh that made rescue nearly impossible even if rescue had been attempted. Voices called through the wood, weaker now, hoarser, some speaking languages that suggested delirium had begun to dissolve the boundaries between past and present. Outside, the guards heard it all. They later testified that the sounds changed as the night progressed. First anger, then pleading, then something that might have been singing, hymns, perhaps, or childhood songs, anything to fill the silence between heartbeats that came slower and slower as oxygen debt mounted in blood already thick with heat. The Nawab's forces celebrated their victory in the courtyard beyond. Torches blazed. Drums echoed off the fort's walls. The sound of laughter drifted through the windows like mockery, reminding the dying that just yards away, life continued with careless abundance. Some prisoners pressed their faces to the bars and shouted for help until their voices failed. Others had passed beyond the point where help seemed possible or even desirable. By the fifth hour, the room had begun to sort its occupants with mechanical precision. The strongest still fought for window space, though their strength was borrowed now from reserves that would not last much longer. The moderately strong had claimed positions against the walls, using stone and timber as allies in their battle against the press of bodies. The weak had fallen into the center, where standing had become impossible and breathing had become a luxury reserved for those above them. The pile in the center grew throughout the night. Bodies collapsed and were trampled by others who lacked the strength to step carefully or the space to step anywhere else. The unconscious provided footing for those still desperately conscious. The dead became furniture in a room where furniture had become survival equipment. A young ensign named Leach found himself trapped near the eastern wall, pressed so tightly between two older men that he could feel their heartbeats through his ribs. He later described the terrible intimacy of that contact, the way fear translated itself through skin, the way desperation could pass from one body to another like a contagion. They died, he said, as they had never lived, without the armor of rank or privilege or distance that had previously separated them. The windows remained the room's most precious real estate. Men who had commanded Indian Ocean trading routes found themselves begging for minutes of access to bars they could barely fit their faces between. The iron had become warm to the touch, heated by the breath of dozens of men who pressed against it in rotation, each taking what air he could before being pulled away by others equally desperate. Near midnight, the character of the crisis shifted again. The initial panic had burned itself out hours ago. The rage had dissolved into exhaustion. Now something else took hold, a terrible patience, the patience of men who understood that they were watching each other die, and that death was arriving not as a sudden violence, but as a gradual subtraction. Breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, some began to speak of home. A clerk from Yorkshire described his mother's garden with the precision of a surveyor, as if mapping paradise from memory. A soldier spoke of morning mist over Scottish highlands, his voice growing softer as the vision grew more vivid. Others retreated into prayer, though the God they addressed seemed absent from that stone tomb beneath the earth. The temperature continued its relentless climb. Human bodies, designed to operate within a narrow range of heat and humidity, began to shut down in order of priority. Non-essential functions ceased. Blood flow concentrated around vital organs. The extremities grew cold even as the core temperature soared, creating the paradox of men who shivered while they roasted. Delirium arrived in waves. Men saw water that wasn't there, felt breezes that existed only in oxygen-starved minds. Some believed they were back in England, in cool parlors drinking tea from china cups. Others thought they were children again, calling for mothers who had been dead for decades. The room filled with phantom conversations, fragments of memory given voice by minds no longer tethered to present reality. The pile in the center had grown silent. Movement there had ceased to be voluntary. Bodies rose and fell with the collective breathing of the mass, a slow rhythm that grew slower with each cycle. Those still conscious on the periphery could hear it, the gradual deceleration of life, the way a clock winds down when no one remembers to tend it. Near the door, someone began to count, not people, that had become impossible, but breaths, counting them like a miser counts coins, hoarding each one against the poverty that was coming. Others took up the count, their voices joining in a whispered arithmetic of survival. 100, 200, 300 breaths, each one potentially the last. The guards outside heard the counting. They later described how it echoed through the door like a prayer or a curse, steady and rhythmic and gradually growing fainter. Some wanted to open the lock. Others argued that orders were orders, that morning would come soon enough, that interference might provoke the Nawab's anger. So they listened, and they waited. And inside the room, the machine continued its work with the patience of stone and the efficiency of mathematics, converting human life into heat and carbon dioxide and silence, breath by breath, until even the counting stopped. By the 6th hour, Fort William's newest prison had become something unprecedented in the annals of confinement, a room that killed not through violence or deliberate cruelty, but through the simple application of physical laws to human flesh. Heat, pressure, and chemistry had collaborated to create a weapon more efficient than any sword, more certain than any gallows. The windows still drew the desperate, but the competition for them had grown languid, dreamlike. Men moved in slow motion, conserving energy for the essential work of breathing. The iron bars had become burning hot from the accumulated body heat and breath of so many mouths pressed against them. Yet still they represented hope, connection to a world outside where air moved freely, and space existed for movement. The door continued to draw the dying. They pressed against it like moths against a lamp, seeking exit from a room that had become a tomb. The wood had grown warm from the heat of so many bodies. The iron lock radiated warmth like a tiny furnace, and through the gaps between planks came the faint sound of the normal world, footsteps, voices, the crackling of torches that seemed to mock the darkness within. In the center of the room the pile had stopped shifting. What had begun as a collection of fallen individuals had become something else, a single mass of human flesh that breathed with collective lungs and moved with shared circulation. Those on the bottom had long since ceased individual existence. Those on top fought to avoid joining them, knowing that descent into that mass meant a form of death that preceded actual dying. The heat had become hallucinogenic. Men saw snow falling inside the room. They felt ice against their skin. Some believed they were swimming in cool lakes, their movements growing languid and peaceful as oxygen debt created euphoria in minds no longer capable of recognizing their own destruction. The room filled with whispered descriptions of winter, of mountain streams, of anything cold enough to counteract the furnace their own bodies had created. Water had become mythology. Men spoke of it as others might speak of angels, something pure and saving that existed in a realm beyond their reach. They described the taste of rain, the feel of morning dew, the sound of rivers running over stone. These descriptions passed through the room like shared dreams, offering momentary relief to minds that could no longer process the reality of their situation. The windows had developed their own ecosystem. Men took turns breathing through them in shifts measured not by time, but by the point of collapse. Each face pressed to the bars drew life from outside air that was only marginally less thick than the atmosphere within. Yet that margin meant survival, if only for minutes more. Behind them, others waited with the patience of the doomed. They had learned not to fight for position, understanding that strength spent in struggle was strength stolen from breathing. Instead, they queued like civilized men, maintaining the courtesies of empire even as empire killed them, degree by degree. The conversation had grown strange. Men spoke to people who weren't there, answered questions no one had asked, conducted business meetings with phantom partners. The heat and oxygen debt had dissolved the boundaries between imagination and memory, between past and present, between life and whatever came after. Some had begun to describe the room as if they were no longer in it. They spoke of themselves in the third person, observing their own dying with the detachment of natural philosophers conducting an experiment. They noted the progression of symptoms, the way consciousness dimmed and brightened like a failing lamp, the manner in which the body gradually ceased to obey the mind's increasingly desperate commands. Near the door the counting had resumed, but now it counted down rather than up, as if someone had calculated the precise number of breaths remaining and was providing a countdown to silence. The voices grew fainter with each number until the counting became a whisper, then a breath, then nothing at all. The guards outside heard the change. Where there had been moaning, pleading, praying, there was now something worse, the slow retreat of sound itself, as if the room was swallowing its own echoes. They pressed their ears to the door and heard what they later described as the sound of a great breathing, slow and deep, and gradually becoming shallower. Inside, the last conscious prisoners experienced something unprecedented in human history, the systematic conversion of a room full of living people into a room full of heat and silence. They watched it happen with the clarity that sometimes comes just before the end, understanding finally that they had become participants in an experiment whose results would be written in stone and memory and imperial rage. The machine was nearly finished with its work, but morning was still hours away, and the door remained closed. The seventh hour brought a silence that was not quite silence. The room still breathed, a collective rise and fall that moved through the mass of bodies like a slow tide. But individual voices had largely ceased. The pleading, the praying, the desperate negotiations with an absent God had given way to something more primitive, the simple mechanics of survival reduced to its most basic elements. Those still conscious existed in a state beyond ordinary experience. The combination of heat, pressure, and oxygen deprivation had created a form of living death, where awareness flickered like a candle flame in a hurricane. Men found themselves observing their own dissolution with scientific detachment, noting how the body shut down system by system, function by function, in accordance with biological priorities they had never needed to understand. The windows had become altars of a different sort now. The desperate competition for air had evolved into something more ritualistic. Men took their turns breathing through the bars with the solemnity of communicants receiving sacrament. Each breath drawn from outside was shared through proximity, the exhale of one becoming the inhale of another in an economy of air so precise that waste meant death. The iron bars themselves had become instruments of torture through simple physics, heated by hours of human breath and the radiant warmth of bodies pressed against them. They burned the skin of anyone who maintained contact for more than moments. Yet letting go meant stepping back into the furnace of the room's interior, where air had become a liquid thing, too thick to breathe, too hot to survive. In the center, the pile had achieved a kind of terrible equilibrium. Bodies compressed by their own weight and the weight of others had created a foundation of flesh that no longer moved independently. Breathing occurred at a cellular level now, the rise and fall so slight as to be nearly imperceptible. Those trapped within that mass had passed beyond individual existence into something collective and unspeakable. The door continued to radiate hope and despair in equal measure. Bodies still pressed against it, though movement had become so minimal that position changed only through the slow settling that occurs when structure begins to fail. Hands that had pounded with desperate strength now rested palm-flat against the wood, feeling for vibrations that might indicate rescue approaching, mercy arriving, morning coming. Through the gaps in the planking came sounds from the world beyond. Guards walking their rounds. Celebration continuing in distant parts of the fort. The normal business of conquest proceeding while 250 square feet of hell operated with mechanical precision just yards away. The contrast between inside and outside had become so absolute that some prisoners believed they had already died and were experiencing some form of afterlife designed specifically for the colonially damned. Hallucinations had become universal. The superheated air and oxygen debt created visions that were shared across the room like a collective fever dream. Men saw the same impossible things. Snow falling upward, ice forming on the stone walls, cool rivers flowing through the space between their feet. These shared delusions provided their own form of comfort, creating a parallel reality where survival was possible and relief was always just moments away. The heat had begun to affect time itself. Minutes stretched into hours, hours compressed into heartbeats. Some prisoners experienced their entire lives replaying in accelerated sequence: childhood, marriage, career, arrival in India, while others felt trapped in single moments that refused to end. The room had become unstuck from ordinary temporal reality, existing in a state where past, present, and future collapsed into the eternal now of each labored breath. Water continued to exist only as memory and imagination. Men described it with the precision of poets and the desperation of mystics. They spoke of morning rain on London streets, of Scottish streams running clear over granite, of the specific taste of well water drawn at dawn. These descriptions became a form of prayer, invoking through words what could not be obtained through flesh. The windows offered glimpses of a universe that seemed infinitely distant. Through the bars, prisoners could see stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering, constant in their cold beauty. Some found comfort in that indifference, understanding that their individual deaths were merely local events in a cosmos too vast for grief. Others raged against the apparent mockery of celestial perfection hanging above terrestrial horror. The guards outside had grown quiet. Their conversation, which had provided a soundtrack of normal life throughout the early hours, had dwindled to occasional murmurs and the sound of boots on stone. Perhaps they understood what was occurring behind the door. Perhaps they preferred not to think about it. Orders were orders, and morning would bring different orders, or at least the end of responsibility for whatever was happening in the darkness they guarded. The pile in the center had begun to emit its own heat signature. The compression of bodies and the lack of air circulation had created a zone of superheated flesh that radiated warmth like a forge. Those conscious prisoners still able to observe noted how the air above that mass shimmered like heat rising from summer pavement, distorting vision and creating the illusion that the room itself was melting. Delirium had evolved beyond simple hallucination into something more profound, a systematic dissolution of the boundaries between self and other, between individual consciousness and collective experience. Men spoke with the voices of dead comrades. They answered questions posed by phantom superiors. They conducted conversations with their own younger selves, seeking advice from innocence they had lost decades before arriving in this stone tomb. The door had developed its own mythology. Prisoners spoke of it as if it were a living entity, something with intentions and desires, rather than merely a barrier of wood and iron. They negotiated with it, pleaded with it, cursed it, with the passion of men who understood that their entire universe had been reduced to the question of whether those planks would open or remain closed. Near the 8th hour, something new entered the chemistry of the room. Acceptance. Not resignation, which implied defeat, but a more complex recognition that what was happening transcended individual will or desire. The machine they had become was operating according to laws more fundamental than human preference. Physics was indifferent to rank, wealth, nationality, or innocence. Heat was heat. Oxygen was oxygen. Flesh was flesh. And mathematics was mathematics. This acceptance brought its own form of peace. Men who had spent hours fighting for position, arguing for precedence, demanding special consideration based on status or family connections, began to share what little they had with what little grace they could manage. Water that existed only in imagination was distributed with the solemnity of communion. Air that barely deserved the name was offered to others with generosity born of shared doom. The windows continued to provide connection to the outside world, though that connection had become increasingly theoretical. The difference in air quality between inside and outside remained significant enough to sustain life for additional minutes, but those minutes had begun to feel like borrowed time. Each breath drawn from beyond the bars was a gift whose cost was measured in the suffering of others who waited for their turn to receive similar gifts. The counting had resumed, but in a different form. Rather than tallying breaths or heartbeats, voices now counted memories, childhood summers, wedding anniversaries, ships safely arrived in harbor, children born healthy. Each memory shared was added to a collective accounting of lives lived before this final convergence, as if the room was taking inventory of all the experience it was about to convert into heat and silence. The temperature had stabilized at a level that medical science would later determine to be incompatible with prolonged human survival. Yet survival continued, minute by minute, through the application of will to circumstances that should have ended consciousness hours ago. The human capacity for endurance, it seemed, exceeded even careful calculation when the alternative to endurance was immediate death. Some prisoners had begun to experience a phenomenon that would puzzle investigators for decades to come: perfect recall of sensory experiences from earlier in their lives. They could taste their mother's cooking with absolute precision. They could feel the texture of clothing they had worn as children. They could smell the specific combination of wood smoke and roses that had characterized their childhood homes. These memories arrived not as nostalgia, but as immediate sensation, as if the extremity of their situation had dissolved the barriers between past and present. The door remained closed. The guards remained silent, and the machine continued its work with the patience of geology and the precision of mathematics, converting human hope into human heat, 1 degree at a time, while the stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had remained unchanged since long before Fort William was built and would continue long after its stones had crumbled into the same dust that was slowly filling the lungs of the men dying behind its walls. The 8th hour was ending. Dawn was still hours away, and in a room 18 feet by 14 feet, the British Empire was learning a lesson it would remember for centuries: that conquest without consideration of consequences could transform victory into horror with the efficiency of a perfectly designed machine. The 9th hour arrived without ceremony, marked only by the gradual shift from desperate survival to something beyond survival, a state where consciousness became optional and breathing became automatic rather than deliberate. The room had achieved its final configuration, a carefully balanced ecosystem of heat, pressure, and diminishing life that operated according to principles no architect had ever intended to design. Those still aware enough to observe noted how silence had layers. Beneath the absence of voices lay the absence of movement. Beneath the absence of movement lay the absence of struggle. And beneath the absence of struggle lay something else entirely: the slow, inexorable rhythm of a single organism breathing with collective lungs, its individual components no longer distinguishable from the whole. The windows had become something like shrines, not because they offered salvation, that hope had died hours ago, but because they provided witness. The night sky visible through the iron bars served as evidence that a universe existed beyond this stone box, that somewhere stars still burned in darkness that was cool and infinite rather than hot and contained. Men pressed their faces to those openings not to breathe, but to remember what it felt like to see beyond the immediate horizon of their own dying. The door had evolved beyond its original function as barrier or portal. It had become a monument to the arbitrary nature of authority, a testament to how quickly human systems could create consequences that exceeded human intention. The wood had grown warm from the heat of so many bodies pressed against it. The iron lock radiated warmth like a brand. Together they formed a seal, not just on the room, but on the night itself, containing within those few square feet a perfect demonstration of how empire operated, when reduced to its essential elements. In the center of the room, the pile had achieved a kind of geological permanence. What had begun as a collection of fallen individuals had transformed through pressure and time into something that resembled a natural formation, a hill of flesh that rose and fell with tidal regularity, breathing the way mountains breathe, slowly and collectively and with infinite patience. Those trapped within that formation had passed beyond individual experience into something unprecedented in human history: conscious participation in their own geological transformation. The heat had stabilized at levels that created their own climate. Currents of superheated air moved through the room in predictable patterns, rising from the massive bodies and flowing along the stone walls before sinking again into the crowd. Men learned to position themselves within these currents the way sailors learn to work with wind, using the movement of heated atmosphere to gain momentary relief, or at least to delay the inevitable by precious seconds. Water had transcended physical reality to become pure concept. Prisoners spoke of it not as something they had once consumed, but as something they had once been. They remembered being water, flowing cool and clear through landscapes they described with cartographic precision. These weren't hallucinations, but transformations, men literally becoming the thing they most desperately needed, dissolving the boundaries between desire and identity until thirst became a form of prayer, and prayer became a form of drowning. The conversation that continued was no longer dialogue, but something closer to collective narration. Individual voices merged into a shared storytelling that described not the room they occupied, but the rooms they had left behind. Parlors in England, offices in Calcutta, ships' cabins on the Indian Ocean. Each described space was furnished with perfect detail, as if memory had become more real than present reality, as if the room they died in was merely a temporary interruption in lives being lived elsewhere. Time had become elastic, stretching and contracting according to biological rather than mechanical rhythms. Seconds expanded into geological epochs when measured by heartbeats that came slower and slower. Minutes compressed into instantaneous flashes when consciousness flickered on and off like a failing lamp. The room existed in multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously, each prisoner experiencing duration according to the specific chemistry of his own dissolution. The windows continued to frame glimpses of eternity. Through the bars, the progression of stars across the Bengal sky told the story of the night's passage with astronomical precision. Constellations wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, marking time according to celestial mechanics that remained indifferent to terrestrial suffering. Some prisoners found comfort in that indifference, understanding that their deaths were merely local events in a universe too vast for grief. The guards outside had entered their own form of vigil. They no longer spoke among themselves. They no longer moved unless duty required it. They stood at their posts like sentries guarding not a prison but a tomb, listening to sounds that grew fainter with each passing hour, while understanding that opening the door might release something worse than death, the knowledge that they had participated in its creation. Delirium had evolved beyond individual hallucination into shared revelation. Men experienced collective visions that were identical in detail. Gardens where roses bloomed in perpetual spring, libraries where books contained only cooling words, ships that sailed on seas of ice toward harbors built of snow. These weren't escapes from reality but transformations of it, the systematic replacement of heat with cold, of confinement with freedom, of dying with something that transcended the biological definition of life. The pile in the center had begun to emit sounds that were not quite human. Breathing occurred so slowly that each inhalation seemed to draw air from some infinite reservoir, while each exhalation released not just carbon dioxide but something else, the accumulated essence of experience being converted into atmosphere. Those still conscious enough to listen heard in those sounds the echo of everything the dying had ever been. Children, soldiers, merchants, lovers, fathers, sons. The door had developed its own acoustic properties. The wood and iron had been warmed by so much human contact that they resonated with different frequencies than cold materials would produce. When fists struck the planks now, and they still did occasionally, with the persistence of reflex rather than hope, The sound was muffled, absorbed, converted into heat rather than echoing as percussion. The room was consuming even sound, metabolizing every form of energy it could extract from the lives it processed. Near the 10th hour, consciousness itself began to fragment in predictable ways. Men experienced their awareness as something separate from their bodies, observing their own dying from positions that seemed to float above or beside the physical form they had always assumed was themselves. This separation was not mystical, but mechanical, the result of oxygen debt creating neurological experiences that transcended ordinary perception while remaining entirely explicable through medical science. These floating consciousnesses described what they observed with the detachment of natural philosophers. They noted how skin changed color as circulation failed. They cataloged the specific ways faces transformed when breathing became optional rather than automatic. They provided commentary on their own deaths with the precision of men conducting experiments in which they were simultaneously researcher and specimen. The windows had become something beyond portal or aperture. They were now connection points between two different universes, the cooling world outside where air moved freely and stars burned with cold fire, and the heating world inside where every molecule had been claimed by flesh and every space had been filled with the expanding geometry of human dissolution. Those who pressed their faces to the bars were ambassadors between these worlds, translating experience from one realm to the other. The heat continued its systematic work, not just warming bodies, but fundamentally altering them. Sweat had long since ceased to evaporate, instead pooling and mixing with other bodily fluids to create a medium that was part atmosphere, part ocean. Men breathed liquid as much as air, their lungs adapting to process whatever medium was available while their consciousness adapted to accept whatever experience was offered. Memory had become more vivid than immediate sensation. Prisoners experienced their entire lives with perfect clarity while losing the ability to perceive their present circumstances. They were simultaneously 5 years old and 50, simultaneously standing in their childhood gardens and dying in a stone tomb, simultaneously innocent of empire's machinery and trapped within its most efficient mechanism. The door remained closed, the guards remained silent, and the machine continued its work with the patience of stone and the precision of physics, converting human complexity into human simplicity, reducing empire's most sophisticated servants to their most basic elements, heat, carbon dioxide, and the gradually diminishing electrical activity that had once organized flesh into consciousness. The 10th hour was ending. Dawn remained hours away, and in a room that measured 18 feet by 14 feet, the British Empire was completing an education in the mathematics of consequence, learning with each passing minute that power without consideration of climate, authority without respect for chemistry, and conquest without understanding of the human architecture that sustained it could create monuments to horror with the efficiency of the finest engineering the 18th century could provide.